Hi, I'm Helen Besant and welcome to the webinar for the third specialist unit of the Advanced Diploma in Strategic Learning and Development. So this unit is 7LD03 and it's designing learning to improve performance. The aim of today's webinar is, first of all, I'm going to provide an overview of the unit, just a brief overview, and then we'll move on to look at the actual assessment and how this unit is assessed. And then we'll finish by looking at and discussing the requirements at this level of study. So what you need to bear in mind really when you're doing the assessment questions. So the assessment brief that this webinar relates to is the most recently released assessment brief for this unit. The ID number is on the screen, but it's the one that was released in June 2024. So the focus of the unit then is to examine the significance then of learning, design and delivery, considering the organisational context and needs. So it's looking at the design and delivery of learning with an organisation to improve organisational performance. The detail behind the unit can be found in the unit specification, and that's a document that's produced by CIPD, and that gives you an overview of all of the units of this particular qualification. But what you'll find is that the unit consists of 4 learning outcomes and 15 assessment criteria. So looking at the assessment itself then, you will be required to answer 4 different questions of approximately 1,000 words each. So your answers will need to be approximately 1,000 words plus or minus 10%. So the overall total word count for your assessment will be 4,000 words plus or minus the 10%. So the questions within the assessment brief will assess your knowledge and understanding across all 4 learning outcomes. So we'll be looking at the learning outcomes for the entire unit. You must look at, when you're answering each question, can you make sure that you're indicating which question you're answering, but also which learning outcome and assessment criteria that particular question relates to, and just use some headings and subheadings to actually be able to highlight that. And also think about the context of the question. That's really important, that you're thinking about it is a business focused qualification, so think about the context of the business, and also think about the audience of which your answers are going to be pitched at. So for this particular assessment, it's pitched towards line managers, and the assessment brief starts by noting that it's widely reported that employee development is the main route followed by most organisations to improve organisational performance, which in turn requires an understanding of the process and techniques of organisational, team and individual learning. And then it goes on and just there's a bit about it's recognised that line managers are the gatekeepers to employee learning. So their buy-in is crucial, their support is crucial to the success of any learning and development initiatives within the organisation. So the purpose of the assessment then is to extend the knowledge of the line managers within your organisation, some of the key principles and the developments in this area. So when you're asked to relate the answers to either your own organisation or an organisation which you're familiar with, it's really important that you do that, because that application of your knowledge to the particular context and the business context is your opportunity for you to demonstrate your understanding of these key principles and kind of the developments in the area of learning and development. So it's really important then that you relate the questions and the answers to either the organisation you work for or one that you're familiar with. So that might be one you used to work for example. If we move on, look at the questions then. The first question is very straightforward, and it's kind of a bit of a two-parter. It's asking you first to define both learning and development, discussing how two separate external factors and two internal factors are currently impacting the organisation's learning and development policy. So the first bit is where you're defining from your wider reading, defining what learning is and what development is, so that you're showing that you appreciate that there are differences. And then moving on to discuss how two separate external and two internal factors are currently impacting the organisation's learning and development policy. And that's where you're really showing your understanding of the organisation, because you're showing that you appreciate what external factors are impacting learning and development within the organisation, but also what internal factors. So it's really it's really relating it to your organisation, but you will also need to complete your wider reading to support the points that you're making within that discussion. So there will be a need also to reference back to your wider reading when you're discussing how those external factors and how those internal factors are impacting the organisation's learning and development policy. And the important thing is that you focus on the how. How are those factors impacting it? The second question then is looking at some learning needs analysis, and it's explain why individual learning needs analysis needs to be in line with the organisational needs analysis, evaluating two tools or approaches that can be used to effectively identify individual employee learning needs within the organisation. So again, this is almost a two-part question, because the first bit is where you're focusing on needs analysis and you're explaining why the individual needs analysis of the individual employees needs to align with the needs analysis of learning and development for the organisation as a whole. So it's explaining that in the first instance, and then moving on and evaluating, looking at what would work well or not so well, or the advantages, disadvantages of two tools or approaches that can be used to identify individual employee learning needs. So it's a needs analysis then for the individual employees, but it's an evaluation of two ways of doing that. The third question is looking at the evaluation of any learning and development. So this is asking you, the particular specific question is critically review two different approaches that can be adopted by the organisation to measure the impact and transfer of any future learning and development initiatives. So given that the organisation will introduce future learning and development initiatives, this is asking you to critically review two different approaches then that can be adopted by the organisation to measure the impact and transfer of those learning and development initiatives. So there's a number of well-known models which you could use. You've got the CIPC RAM model, obviously Kirkpatrick, the Brinkerhoff case study model. So that's just to name but a few. So there are various approaches and models that can be included here. It's just a very straightforward question. I think the important thing is that you're ensuring that you are critically reviewing those approaches rather than just describing or explaining them. So there needs to be some criticality in your thinking about them, why they would be what might be their advantages. I mean, sometimes you might look and say, well, it's quite time consuming, but it's still very effective, for example. So there's lots of things that the literature will identified, but it's important that you approach it thinking about it strategically, thinking about not just explaining or describing these models or these approaches, but thinking about a critical review of how they can be, that could be adopted and how they will measure the impact and transfer so it's looking at to what extent they will be effective in achieving that. So that's the important thing I think with that is it is straightforward, but make sure that you're not just describing or explaining those approaches or models, that you are critically reviewing them within the context of the organisation. And finally then, question 4. This is looking at accommodating different learning styles and requirements when you're designing any learning and development activities. So drawing upon examples, analyse the importance of learning professionals considering and accommodating individual learning styles and different needs, such as there's language, disabilities, so if cultural needs or any specific individual needs when designing any learning and development initiatives to help maximise learning transfer. So if we're thinking then that any initiatives that we design we should be aiming to maximise learning transfer. So to be able to achieve this, you need to be able to draw on examples and analyse the importance of learning professionals to consider and accommodate those individual learning styles. And so it's not just learning styles, but it's the learning styles and different needs such as language and disability. So do analyse the importance of accommodating those when designing your learning and development initiatives to ensure that you are looking at helping to maximise learning transfer. So I would suggest and really recommend that when you are attempting any assessment questions, that you keep in mind the main marking criteria. So these are the criteria that you use when your assessments are actually marked. So the first one there is focus, making sure that your answer is focused and directed to the questions asked. Showing the depth and breadth of understanding, so making sure that you're not showing just superficial knowledge, but that you are being able to demonstrate a level of understanding, and that will come in your levels of analysis and how you relate those in context to the organisation, and the application of that knowledge will really come through when you're considering that within the context of the organisation itself. And that will also help you show your level of strategic thinking. So it's rising kind of above the operational kind of day-to-day explanations of certain initiatives, for example, but it's looking at the kind of the strategic application of particular principles or theories, and also how you can give professional advice. So again, that's about thinking about the bigger picture, thinking about things more holistically. So if you are, for example, looking at evaluating 2 tools to identify individual learning needs, so that is kind of looking at the wider, bigger picture of the organisation and how that might happen and why it would be appropriate for the employees and the various stakeholders within the organisation. You must also, it's essential that you're researching and accessing the published literature, and you're using that or the literature to inform all of your responses, and you're referencing the sources. Now they're going to support the points you make, but also help develop what we refer to as original arguments. It's important that you're looking at developing those within your answers. Also consider the presentation and language used. This is a professional qualification, so think about ensuring, and it's business focused, and think about how you can clearly present your answers and use an appropriate, adopt appropriate writing style. for this level. So to expand on those, if you refer to the genetic grade descriptors, which is in the grid that comes with the assessment brief. So if we have a look at the this particular grid, so this comes with all the assessment briefs. On the left hand side, you've got the genetic grade descriptors, and they are the criteria. So you focus, your depth and breadth of understanding, and then those expanded on then in the other columns to actually give you some indication of what you need to be doing to achieve the various grades, so pass, merit or distinction. But to actually help and give you a little bit more guidance, I thought I'd just expand on that a little bit more as just some final kind of tips really as to what you need to be thinking about demonstrating when you're answering the assessment questions. So I would say it's really important that you clearly plan your answers, read and dissect the question, and then you think about how you can best structure your answer, and what are the main points you need to include, what might be the main arguments, what sources are you going to be using to support the points that you want to make. Making sure then that when you answer the question, that you are really providing a direct response to what has been asked. It is so easy to kind of lose track, go off on a bit of a tangent, especially if you're kind of really interested in the subject and you've done lots of background reading. You can get kind of blinkered really in terms of what is being asked, and I mean, it could be that you missed part of a question, and then if you did, unfortunately, you wouldn't have been addressing entirely what has been asked. So I think it helps you to stay focused if you can actually clearly plan each of your answers and you think about the structure of them, and that will help you then to have a much more focused response. When you come in to demonstrate your depth of knowledge and understanding, that is coming from your wider reading, and it's where you're using the knowledge that you've read and you've acquired, and then applying that within the context of the actual assessment question. So that being able to apply that that knowledge strategically as well. So you're thinking about elevating your writing and thinking about that bigger picture, thinking about how does this apply to the organisation, the context of the organisation, and if you find that you're becoming quite descriptive, well then please stop, because you're not required to write lots of descriptive text. You are looking at having a much more business focused strategic response, and in most cases that will come from that application within the context of the organisation, but also making sure that you're responding accordingly to the command verbs within a question. So for example, if you are asked to critically review something or critically evaluate something, it doesn't mean to be critical, but it's looking at the subject from different perspectives. So, for example, if you were doing an evaluation of something, there would be some positives and there would be some downsides of a particular model or an approach or whatever it was that you were looking at evaluating. And again, if it was an analysis of something, you're looking at showing a deeper understanding of why that was occurring, or what would be the implications of that within the organisation, on the stakeholders. So it's really having a much more holistic view. So you're ensuring that you're showing that depth of understanding and you're applying a strategic approach to your answers. Now, using your wider reading is absolutely essential in every answer, even when you're applying your answers to your own organisation, the points that you make need to have been developed from what you've read from the literature. So, for example, you might read various different sources, different authors will have different viewpoints, and you need to analyse and synthesise that and use that information then in your words, but to respond to the question, but then referencing back to the authors that you use to form those particular arguments. The important thing here also is that the sources that you use must be appropriate. And what we mean that is they must be written by experts in their field. So please avoid the use of generic websites, sites such as LinkedIn, or using blogs. They are not written by experts in their field, and therefore they're not credible, they're not reliable. So please avoid using those. We need to be focusing on using credible research evidence, and we have so much access and we have access to so many different research articles. For example, you could use the CIPD themselves. So the CIPD commission so much relevant research to this particular qualification. And if you go to their Knowledge Hub and have a look in the Knowledge Hub and do a search there, there should be lots of research articles that you will find useful. Also within the Knowledge Hub, you've got the online database of academic journals, so that's EBSCO. If you are going to use that, it's just use the advanced search because that allows you to narrow down your research and it'll save you a bit of time. So yeah, do use the advanced search. I mean, there might be other academic databases that you have access to. The other thing that can be quite useful is the people management publication. So it's what we get. We get it in hard copy, but you can actually go back through the archives and look at all the back copies. And I find that's really useful if you're looking for particular organisational case studies on a particular subject area. And it's quite useful when you're looking at possibly supporting a particular argument or point that you want to make for your organisation. So yeah, I would suggest that a lot of the people management or L&D publications would be really useful for you. But the important thing is that they're reliable, they're credible, and currency as well. Make sure they're current. Try not to get things that are too dated because they're going to be less relevant to today's world of work. So, think about the sources that you're using and making sure that they are appropriate. And then use those sources to develop those arguments and support the arguments with reference to them, but also make sure that you're supporting your points by linking it back to the organisation and why a particular approach, for example, would be appropriate to your organisation and its context. And then think about the presentation. I mentioned presentation earlier when we were looking at the marking guidance, but you're not necessarily being asked to write essays. You're writing answers to questions that need to be professionally presented. So think about how you might use headings or subheadings, maybe to highlight the main points or provide structure to your answers. I think what it also does, it kind of demonstrates that you have some logical thinking and that you've applied logical thinking when writing your answers. And one final thing is to keep track of the word limits for each of the assessments, and that must be in line with the CIPD word count policy. So if you're not familiar with that or you think you should revisit it, I would suggest you do that because if your work is under or over the lower upper limits, well then it won't be able to be marked. So it's important that you are adhering to the CIPD word count policy and you're familiar with what's included and what isn't included. And then as we come towards the end of this webinar, I really do hope you enjoy studying this unit and that you find that you get a lot out of it. And also I hope that you found this webinar has been useful. And this provide you some additional guidance in addition to obviously all the input that you will get from your centres. If you have found it useful, there are other webinars for the qualifications, so for the core units and the other specialist units, there's webinars available for those as well that you might want to listen to. So thank you for listening, and I wish you well.